At 18 minutes past 3 on a summer afternoon, a man sat handcuffed on the warm asphalt of an eerie parking lot, begging the officers around him to hurry. Locked around his neck was a metal collar, and inside that collar, a bomb was counting down. He'd already told them a story that sounded too strange to be true. Strangers had jumped him, he said, fastened the thing to his throat, and ordered him to rob a bank. The officers kept their distance and waited for the bomb squad that could cut it off him, but that squad was still minutes away. And then, with a local news camera trained on him, and the whole scene going out live, the timer reached 0. This case has become known as the Pizza Bomber Incident, and despite being solved, it contains more unsolved mysteries than most truly unresolved cases. Brian Wells was 46 years old, and by almost every account he hadn't lived the most interesting life. Back in 1973, when he was a 16-year-old sophomore, he dropped out of East High School to work as a mechanic. Unfortunately for him, this profession turned out to be too demanding for him, and he never became a full-fledged mechanic. People who knew him described him as somewhat simple-minded, which is something you're probably going to want to keep in mind as I explain this case. For roughly a decade, he delivered pizzas for a little shop called Mamma Mia's Pizzeria. The morning of August 28, 2003, started like any other shift. Then, just after 1:30, the phone at the pizzeria rang. The call came from a payphone outside a gas station nearby, and whoever was on the line was hard to understand, so the owner handed the phone to Wells. The order was simple enough: 2 pizzas, delivered to 8631 Peach Street, only a few miles away. That spot was the base of a television transmission tower sitting at the end of a dirt road, ringed by woods. What happened at the foot of that tower has never been fully nailed down, and remains an unsolved mystery till this day. Law enforcement later concluded that Wells arrived expecting one thing and found another waiting for him. According to that version, he'd been told the plan involved a fake bomb, a harmless prop to make him look like a victim if he were ever caught. At the tower, the story goes, he learned the device was very real after he'd had it affixed to his neck. By then, of course, he was too deep in it to actually step away from the plot, since, well, he had a real bomb strapped to his neck. I've never been in that situation, and I don't imagine you've been either. But your leverage tends to go out the window, I would imagine. His family has always rejected that account flatly, and in their telling, Brian was ambushed by strangers at the tower and forced into the whole nightmare against his will. What the evidence does suggest is that there was a struggle, and that more than one person was there in those woods. A weapon was reportedly fired to force his compliance, and witnesses in the area did say they heard a shot. However, according to the police narrative, this was only done after Brian discovered he didn't get what he had bargained for. Whatever was said at the tower, what came off that desolate road and into the city was a piece of work. The bomb was built into a hinged metal collar that locked around the neck like an oversized handcuff, and 4 keyholes sat under the chin. Behind them was a rectangular housing packed with 2 pipe bombs and a pair of kitchen timers, with a separate electronic timer dangling down over the chest. The thing was also studded with decoys, apparently in an attempt to throw off any bomb squad specialists encountering the device. There were wires that connected to nothing, a toy cell phone, and warning stickers meant to confuse anyone who tried to read it. Bolted to that horror was a set of instructions, and inside Wells's car, investigators found 9 handwritten pages addressed, chillingly, to the bomb hostage. The pages laid out a scavenger hunt. Rob the bank first, the note said, then drive to a series of locations on a tight clock. Along the way, collect keys and codes that would supposedly buy time and eventually remove the collar after perfect compliance. He'd be watched the entire route, the pages warned, and any move toward the authorities would set the bomb off. Scrawled across the bottom was one last shove. He should act first and think later, the note warned, or he wouldn't survive. According to the official narrative, to sell the illusion that he was a victim, Wells was coached on what to tell the police. He was to claim that 3 men had forced the device onto him and were holding him hostage. In case the collar wasn't menacing enough, he was handed a weapon for the robbery itself. It was an improvised weapon made to look like a cane, but in actuality, it had similar capacities to a shotgun. At around 2:30, Brian Wells walked into a PNC Bank branch at the Summit Town Center, just off Peach Street. He got in line, like any customer with somewhere to be, and when he reached the counter, he slid a note across to the teller. The note demanded $250,000 and claimed the bomb on his neck would go off in 15 minutes. The teller simply couldn't move that kind of cash that fast, but what she could hand over was a bag holding $8,702. Wells took it and walked out, and the footage and witness accounts from inside the bank are some of the strangest details in the whole affair. By the time he reached the counter, Wells was calmly sucking on a lollipop. One witness later said he strolled out swinging his cane and the bag of money almost like Charlie Chaplin. At 38 minutes past 2, someone inside the bank dialed 911 and reported a man leaving with what looked like a bomb wrapped around his neck. Wells got back in his car and started working the scavenger hunt, apparently to buy himself time. I say apparently here, because ultimately we don't truly know to what extent he believed that was all necessary. Some have noted that his calm demeanor during the robbery seems inconsistent with someone who believed the bomb was actually real. He reportedly finished the first task and was moving toward the second when the police caught up with him. They found him standing outside his vehicle and took no chances. They cuffed him, walked him back from the car, and sat him down on the pavement. And there, on the ground, Brian Wells told them his story. Not the real story, the one he was instructed to present. This, again, is another piece of evidence to suggest that maybe he truly believed he was in on the whole plot, rather than a tool of some sick minds. 3 people had strapped the bomb to him, he said, given him the weapon, and promised he'd perish unless he robbed the bank and finished the tasks. The officers made the right call by the book, and they didn't try to pull the device off him, because nobody there knew how. Instead, they cleared the area, pushed pedestrians back, and made sure he couldn't trigger it himself. The bomb squad got the call at 4 minutes past 3. That was roughly half an hour after the first 911 call from the bank, and about 10 minutes after Wells had been handcuffed. Heavy traffic slowed the squad's drive across the city, and at 18 minutes past 3, 3 minutes before they arrived, the timer ran out. The blast tore a fist-sized hole in his chest, and Brian Wells was gone within seconds. A local ABC affiliate had been broadcasting the standoff live, but a technical glitch meant viewers didn't see the actual detonation, which was a small mercy. The footage still leaked, and within weeks a copy had made its way to a radio shock jock in Washington who posted it online, and from there it spread to every corner of the early internet. There's a grim footnote to the recovery. The collar survived the explosion intact, still locked around its victim. To preserve the device for analysis, investigators had no choice but to perform an operation of sorts to save the device. Forensic analysis would eventually conclude that even if the bomb squad had arrived, the device would likely have been too complex to safely remove in a reasonable amount of time. The collar had never really been made for removal at all, despite what the instructions said. There's one more cruelty buried in those 9 pages which contained the scavenger hunt to save his life. Long after the fact, investigators actually drove the scavenger hunt route themselves, against the clock the notes had set. They couldn't finish it. The timing was impossible. which means that whatever Brian Wells did that afternoon, whether he robbed the bank perfectly or not, he was never going to make it. He'd been a condemned man from the moment the collar closed, and the people behind it likely knew it, and as you'll see, this group didn't care for loose ends or half measures. For a while, the case looked unsolvable, and it wasn't even necessarily proven that there was anyone else involved in the crime. Then, less than a month later, the phone rang, and with that call, everything would change. On September 20th, 2003, a man named William Rothstein called the police with a confession that had nothing, on its face, to do with the bank. There was a body in his garage, he told them, specifically, in a chest freezer. When investigators arrived at his house, near that very television tower on Peach Road, they found exactly that. The frozen remains turned out to belong to a man named James Roden, and let's just say he kept some very interesting company. Here's where the whole thing starts to fold in on itself. Roden had been the longtime boyfriend of a woman named Marjorie Deal Armstrong. He'd been slain with a 12-gauge during a dispute over money, or at least that's the story the cops were sold at the time. According to Rothstein, Deal Armstrong had done it, then called him in a panic to help her hide the evidence. He claimed she'd paid him $2,000 to clean the scene and stash the body. After he made that call to police, Rothstein left behind a strange note suggesting that he had intended to end himself. He also insisted this action had nothing to do with the pizza delivery man and the bomb collar, which is an odd thing to write if you're truly not involved. Last I checked, when you declare that you definitely didn't commit a crime for no reason whatsoever, as a rule, you've generally been involved. To understand how an ordinary pizza driver ended up with a bomb on his neck, we have to understand the small, strange circle of people who built it. They were misfits who'd known each other, in some cases, for decades, and Marjorie Deal Armstrong was the center of gravity, the ringmaster of this weird circus. Years before, she'd been an exemplary student who earned a master's degree from a local college. Then, somewhere in her 20s, her mental health came apart. And unlike most people who eventually successfully get treatment, she didn't. She lived for years with serious illness, including bipolar disorder, and she left a long trail of partners who met some pretty grim fates. Back in 1984, she'd fired 6 shots into a sleeping boyfriend. She was acquitted of that one, having claimed self-defense, but it set a pattern that's hard to ignore. That said, looking into it just briefly, it very well may have been legitimate self-defense, despite the later turn her life would take. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that it probably was, but I can't imagine the situation didn't cause her further mental anguish, which perhaps explains a lot of what's to come. William Rothstein was an old flame of hers from decades earlier, a handyman and part-time shop teacher with a brilliant, restless mind. He'd been mixed up in a serious crime once before, back in 1977, when he handed a weapon to a friend who used it to cut down a romantic rival. He was, by reputation, one of a loose group of people locals called the fractured intellectuals. Old Billy Rothstein had actually coined this term and spread it around Erie, portraying his group as smart, alienated misfits. Honestly, the whole thing sounds incredibly cringy, and would be comical if they didn't commit such disturbing acts. Wait, scratch that. It's still comical regardless, and you'll see that the bar was pretty low to be considered a quote-unquote fractured intellectual. Bilbo Rothstein is the man investigators came to see as the builder of the collar bomb itself. Then there was Kenneth Barnes, a retired television repairman who dealt crack on the side and counted himself one of Deal Armstrong's fishing buddies. And there was Floyd Stockton, an ex-convict and registered pervert who was then currently on the lam, living under an assumed identity as a fugitive in Rothstein's house. Stockton would later tell investigators that he was the one who fastened the collar around Brian's neck at the tower. So yeah, with that said, we've got some real intellectual heavy hitters here clearly, I say without a hint of sarcasm. The motive, once it surfaced, was completely bizarre when it was discovered. Marjorie Deal Armstrong wanted her father gone, and she believed her elderly father, Harold Deal, was burning through money she considered her inheritance. So the group sat around and talked about how to fix that, the sort of thing high-minded intellectuals do when they're not dealing crack, and the conversation turned to a price. Barnes reportedly told her he'd be willing to eliminate her father for $250,000, which is the exact sum the note demanded from the bank teller. The entire collar bomb spectacle, the scavenger hunt, the disguised weapon, all of it, was a fundraising scheme for a quasi-professional hit. As for why Brian Wells himself ended up wearing a live device instead of the prop he may have been promised, the working theory is bleak. The plotters wanted fewer mouths who could expose the plot, and a man who walks away from a scheme like this is a man who can talk. A man left in a parking lot with a real bomb wouldn't, and James Roden, the body in the freezer, fits the same logic. He'd been living with Deal Armstrong, close enough to know things, and investigators believe he was cut down to keep him from breathing a word about the plan. The bodies and the timeline started pointing in one direction. In January 2005, Deal Armstrong pleaded guilty for what happened to Roden, drawing a sentence of 7 to 20 years. A few months later, she made a fateful decision, and she told a state trooper she knew things about the Wells case. She offered to trade what she knew for a transfer to a softer prison, and across a string of interviews, she admitted she'd supplied the kitchen timers used in the bomb. She pointed at Rothstein as the mastermind and, tellingly, she insisted Wells himself had been in on the plan. Rothstein, the one person who could have answered the deepest questions, was already beyond reach. He'd been slowly consumed by cancer and passed away on July 30th, 2004, at the age of 60. Because he was gone, he was of course never charged, only named later as an unindicted party to the crime who didn't live to see a courtroom. Stockton, the fugitive, was eventually granted immunity for his cooperation, though his death from natural causes meant he was never actually called to the stand. The last domino was Barnes, and late in 2005, while he was sitting in jail on unrelated crack charges, he started talking to a visiting relative, and the relative turned him in. I've got to say, it's a bit disturbing that such a great intellectual like Barnes couldn't see that yapping about his involvement in a high-profile case wouldn't end well for him. In July 2007, a federal prosecutor stood up and announced charges against Deal Armstrong and Barnes, naming her as the mastermind of the whole affair. This was, of course, different from her account of events, which placed the now deceased Rothstein as the puppet master behind the whole grim affair. The prosecution's position was stark, and really does form the core of the unsolved mystery surrounding the case today. Wells had been involved from the beginning, they argued, but his own partners had fitted him with a bomb that was always going to detonate. He was both a perpetrator and a victim, depending on which minute of the day you looked at. According to them, he really truly believed that he was in on it, and may have even believed that up until the very end, though it remains a mystery. Personally, looking at the evidence, I see him more as a simple-minded individual who was manipulated by people much more intelligent and nefarious than he was. While he may have had a good faith belief that he was an active participant, in my mind, he was taken advantage of, and was in the end, more victim than anything else. The legal endings came one at a time, and Barnes pleaded guilty in 2008 and was handed 45 years, later cut to 22 and a half after he testified against Deal Armstrong. She fought hers the whole way, though there were significant questions about whether she was even competent to stand trial, given her severe and untreated mental health issues. In the end, though, It was determined that she was fit to stand trial and that she was of reasonably sound mind at the time the pizza bomber event occurred. Honestly, I don't see how someone could orchestrate such an elaborate and well thought out plan and still be found not criminally responsible by reason of insanity. She had a clear logical framework for doing what she did, and an end goal in mind, even if the entire thing was quite clearly disturbed. In November 2010, a jury convicted her on all counts, and the following February she was sentenced to life in prison, stacked on top of the time she was already serving for Roden. In April 2017, she died behind bars of breast cancer at 68. Barnes, for his part, outlived her by a couple of years and passed away in prison in 2019. There's a detail that surfaced years later that potentially reframes everything, though this was tied to an individual who had some serious credibility issues, to put it mildly. A woman who'd known Wells, someone he trusted, eventually admitted that she was the one who'd handed his name to the plotters. She'd given them his name and his delivery schedule in exchange for money and some dope. She described him in the end as a pushover, and she swore he'd had no idea what was coming. If that's true, then the man sucking a lollipop in line at the bank wasn't a willing player at all. He was a name on a list, picked because he was simple, easily manipulated, and unlikely to put up a fight. So the question that started this whole thing has never fully closed. Was Brian Wells a criminal who got tangled in a scheme far darker than he bargained for? Or was he simply the easiest man to trick into walking into a bank with a bomb locked around his throat? In the end, the people who could have answered it took their answers into the ground, one after another. Personally, I think it's a little bit of both, that Brian Wells was both a passive victim and an active perpetrator in this awful event. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy as usual, jumping in with a quick reminder to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell for more content. Also, don't forget to check out the merch store and the Patreon to take your support for my channel to the next level. A 20-year-old walks out his back door on a spring afternoon to put a pair of jumper cables away in a shed just outside the house. Two men are in the driveway with their heads under the hood of a car. A friend is inside, cleaning. It's broad daylight in a highly sinister little town of a few hundred people, the sort of place where 40 people witness a man being cut down in the street and nobody talks to the cops. He never comes back, and when police finally search that shed, the jumper cables aren't even there. At least, not until a couple weeks later. Branson Perry was born on the 24th of February, 1981, and grew up in Skidmore, a farming town in the northwest corner of Missouri. He graduated from Nodaway Holt High School in 1999 and drifted through the kind of work a young man finds in a small place. He did a stint with a roofing crew and took a job helping look after the animals in a traveling petting zoo. By the spring of 2001, he was between jobs. He lifted weights, he'd earned a black belt in Hapkido, and he liked being outdoors. People in Skidmore describe him as easygoing and well-liked, with no enemies, though as you'll see, this town is incredibly dark, so take that under advisement. Friends and relatives said vanishing without a word was completely out of character, because he stayed in close touch with the people he loved. He had a heart condition that made his pulse race, though nothing that kept him from a normal life. He stood 5'9", blonde and blue-eyed, and clocked in at around 155 pounds. Keep that hair color and general appearance in mind, because trust me, it'll be coming up again. He liked to wear necklaces strung with leather and arrowheads, a detail that would matter more than anyone guessed. He lived with his father, Bob, on West Oak Street at the time that he disappeared. His parents had recently divorced, and his mother, Rebecca, had moved into a new chapter of her own. On the 11th of April, 2001, Bob Perry was laid up in the hospital and due home soon. Branson wanted the house clean before his father got back, so he'd asked a friend over to help him tidy up. Outside, two other men were bent over Bob's car, which needed a new alternator. Sometime around 3 in the afternoon, Branson told his friend he was going to run a set of jumper cables out to the shed beside the house. That was the last time anyone admits to seeing him, and he didn't take his vehicle, and he didn't pack a bag. His money, his clothes, everything he owned stayed exactly where it sat. A young man with a heart condition and no working car simply evaporated from his own backyard in the middle of the day, with people standing close enough to hear him call out. The first person to sense something was wrong was his grandmother, Joanne, who the next day stopped by and found the house unlocked and empty. That wasn't like Branson, so she kept calling over the following days and never got an answer. When she finally reached his mother, she learned that Rebecca hadn't heard from him either. Bob was discharged later than expected, and only after he came home did the family file a missing person report. By then, it was the 17th of April, 6 full days after Branson had stepped out the door, and whatever trail there might have been had gone cold before anyone really started looking. Once the search began, Nottoway County authorities organized ground parties that combed the countryside for roughly 15 miles in every direction. They worked through fields, farms, and abandoned buildings in the area, but they found nothing. At first there was hope he'd just taken off to clear his head, but his wallet and clothes sat untouched, and it got harder by the day to believe he'd left on his own. And then there's the detail nobody has ever been able to square. When investigators first looked inside that shed, the jumper cables Branson had supposedly carried out were nowhere to be found. 2 weeks later, they turned up sitting just inside the door, as though someone had set them there after the fact. How they got back has never been explained, and no one has ever admitted to putting them there. In the weeks after the disappearance, more than 100 people were interviewed, and a murkier picture of Branson's last days and his lifestyle began to surface. The friend who'd been helping him clean admitted that the two of them had recently been using serious quantities of dope, including weed and meth. A relative reported that Branson had a bottle of Valium on him the day he vanished, and there were rumors, never quite pinned down, that he owed money to the kind of people you don't want to owe. Investigators followed those threads south to St. Joseph, where they questioned people Branson knew through the local drug scene. Each of them claimed they hadn't seen him, and reportedly each one passed a polygraph, though as you probably know, those aren't exactly reliable. Then came a tip that, after leaving home that afternoon, Branson had been spotted at a house about a mile outside Quitman. This was a place locally understood to be somewhere you could score basically any substance you were in the market for, a trap house to put it bluntly. Less than a week after he disappeared, and before he'd even been reported missing, that house burned to the ground, and nobody ever established who lit the match. In April of 2003, the case took its strangest and most disturbing turn. Police in central Missouri arrested a 59-year-old Presbyterian minister and former Boy Scout leader named Jack Wayne Rogers. He'd performed a crude, unlicensed operation on a woman in a hotel room in Columbia and was booked on first-degree assault and practicing medicine without a license. When investigators examined his computer, things got far worse. And honestly, I can't even fully describe the extent of it, nor do I want to. They found the most disturbing material imaginable, and posts he'd written on online message boards under a handful of usernames. He described in graphic detail the things he wished to do to young blonde men against their will. In one of them, Rogers described picking up a young blonde male hitchhiker and ending the life of that young man before burying the body in a remote stretch of the Ozarks. The description fit Branson, right down to the hair color. The other stories he posted were even more disgusting, indicating just what sort of deeply sick individual the cops had bagged. When police searched Rogers' vehicles, They turned up a turtle claw necklace that resembled one Branson used to wear. For a while, it looked like that story may have been a veiled confession that might finally account for a blonde young man who'd vanished 2 years earlier. Rogers insisted he'd never met Branson and that the post was nothing more than a sick fantasy, but law enforcement wasn't so sure. In 2004, he was convicted and handed a 30-year sentence for his crimes, though he wasn't charged with anything related to Branson. At his sentencing, Branson's mother stood before him and begged him to say what he'd done with her son. He gave her nothing, leaving her heartbroken and assuming that she would never be able to get justice for her son. And yet, within months, Rebecca herself came to doubt he was involved. The necklace and the matching description were suggestive, but suggestive isn't proof, and investigators eventually swung their attention back toward Skidmore more broadly. It's impossible to talk about Branson Perry without talking about where he vanished from, because Skidmore is a town that seems almost cursed. 2 decades earlier, the local bully, Kenneth Rex McElroy, was Swiss cheesed up in the middle of the street in front of dozens of townspeople on a summer morning in 1981. He'd been terrorizing the town for years, and not one of them would say who'd pulled the trigger. I've actually covered this case before, a number of years back, and he's perhaps one of the worst people I've ever covered. I have to revisit that case since back then I was new to content creation and my scripts were short and amateurish at best. Neither a grand jury nor federal investigators could crack the wall of silence the town built around it, and no one was ever charged. That instinct, the reflex to look away and keep quiet, is the backdrop Branson's case has always been read against. A few years after he disappeared, his own cousin, Bobby Jo Stinnett, 8 months pregnant, was slain in her Skidmore home. That case drew national headlines and tied the Perry name to 2 of the most notorious crimes the state has ever produced. And just to put this in context, as to why I'm saying the town seems cursed, this place has less than 300 people living in it. The per capita crime rate of Skidmore is something that I'm sure sociologists and criminologists have studied by this point, but I'm getting off topic. The drug angle never fully went away, and it ran into the same wall as the McElroy case. People who might know something were afraid to say it. Before she passed, Rebecca said she was convinced that somebody in or around Skidmore knew exactly what had become of her son and had chosen to keep it to themselves. In 2009, acting on a credible tip, investigators excavated a site near Quitman, digging a hole more than 20 feet deep and dozens of feet across, but they came up with nothing. The family searched oil wells and old outhouses, every dark place a body might be hidden. The case has never been closed, and in 2022, the Nottoway County Sheriff announced that a suspect had finally been identified. However, despite this announcement, there was a major catch. There still wasn't enough evidence to make an arrest. 2 years later, the feds joined, drawn by a fresh tip about a well in the countryside near Quitman. Around the same time, 2 people independently pointed investigators to a patch of ground nearby, swearing Branson was buried there. When it was dug up, the soil looked disturbed, as if something had been put in and later taken out, but there was no trace of Branson himself. Somebody out in that quiet stretch of Missouri knows what happened in the few steps between a back door and a shed, but whatever sinister force clouds this town has kept them from talking. Anyway, I'm kind of fascinated by the town of Skidmore, given the fact that it's clearly punching above its weight in the true crime world. If you're from Skidmore, or if you're familiar with the area, take a moment to comment since I'm interested in getting a read on the town from a local. In March of 1993, 2 hikers picking their way through the brush of the Angeles National Forest came across a human skull lying in the dirt. When investigators recovered the rest of the partial skeleton scattered nearby, dental records gave the remains a name: That name reopened a wound that had been festering in a San Fernando Valley household for more than a year. The skull belonged to a 20-year-old wife and mother named Kimberly Pandelios, who'd walked out her own front door for a modeling job and simply never come back. The job, it turned out, had never existed, and the man who'd invented it would manage to stay free for another 11 years. The mystery here isn't that the case is unsolved, it's the rather curious reason why it stayed a cold case for as long as it did, and let's just say, I have some questions. Kimberly Pandelios was 20 years old in the winter of 1992. She lived in Northridge, California, with her husband Peter and the couple's 13-month-old son. She was the kind of young woman who was trying to build something for herself. She'd enrolled in business courses, she picked up part-time modeling work, and she was chasing the sort of break that the Los Angeles area dangles in front of everyone. In that world, at that time, modeling gigs often came through classified ads in the local papers, and Kimberly, like a lot of aspiring models on a tight budget, answered them. On February 27, 1992, Kimberly told Peter she was heading out to that shoot. Investigators later pieced together that she'd been in contact with a man who called himself Paul. The babysitter watching her son remembered his calls clearly. Paul rang the house around 2 in the afternoon to confirm the appointment, then again at 7 that evening, by which point Kimberly was already gone. He mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd left her appointment book behind when the two of them had met earlier. An appointment book belonging to a woman who answered classified ads for a living was exactly the kind of object that could name the person she'd gone to meet. Kimberly never came home, and the next day, February 28th, her car was found burned out on a road near the Angeles forest. The fire had been set on the passenger side, and investigators believed Kimberly herself had driven the vehicle to that spot before whatever happened to her happened. Inside were the charred remains of a spiral notebook. Weeks later, a second notebook, with her schedule, turned up under a bridge a couple of miles away. The book was full of numbers, and for reasons which are unclear to me, the investigation into those numbers seems to have been quite limited at the time. Notably, this won't be the first time that the perpetrator remained free because detectives didn't follow up on a lead, but more on that in a moment. Aside from that, there was nothing else, and for a time, the case went cold. Then came the skeleton in March 1993, lying about 50 yards from an old campsite. Now police had a body, but they were no closer to the man who'd left it there. For Kimberly's family, the discovery confirmed the worst, while answering almost nothing about who'd done it. One witness, given the cover name Jeff, came forward to say he'd driven past a campsite around the time Kimberly vanished. He'd seen a young blonde woman sitting near a brown van, guarded by several rough-looking men who'd shouted at him to clear off. When Kimberly's photo later aired on television, Jeff became convinced she was the woman he'd seen. For years, the leading theory held that a group of men had taken her captive somewhere in the forest, done some horrible things, and then dumped her body. It was a vivid account, and it pointed investigators in entirely the wrong direction. Much later, authorities would conclude that Jeff had simply been mistaken, and that the blonde woman at the campsite was never Kimberly at all. Suspicion later swung toward Charles Rathbun, a photographer arrested for the slaying of another aspiring model named Linda Sobeck. I covered her case very recently, which is how I found out about Kimberly's case. Both women were young, attractive, and lured by the promise of a shoot, and both were found within a few miles of each other in the same stretch of forest. A witness even claimed to have spotted Rathbun with Kimberly at a Denny's, but the evidence didn't hold up, and he was eventually cleared. The truth, as it happened, revolved around a very different man entirely. David Raidmaker wasn't a photographer at all. He was something far more sinister. He was a convict who, around the time Kimberly disappeared, was reportedly running a variety of illicit operations, including an underground escort ring. He moved through the same shadowy world of personal ads and classifieds that Kimberly had been navigating in search of legitimate work. The authorities came to believe that he was the Paul who'd called the Pandelios home, and that he had been using an alias. He'd had her number on the day she vanished, and she'd had his, and yet the thread that finally led to him didn't come from forensics or anything more conventional. Raidmaker, it emerged, had a habit of talking, perhaps bragging, about crimes. He'd told a girlfriend named Manya Senzov about the slaying more than once. On one occasion, the two of them happened to be watching a television broadcast about the case, the one pushing the theory about a gang of men taking her. Raidmaker scoffed that the whole story was wrong, and he told her he'd taken a young model into the forest, that she'd resisted his advances, and that he'd dealt with her when she did. He said Kimberly had begged him to let her go, swearing she'd never go to the police, but he didn't believe her. He said he drowned her in a creek, and he even claimed he'd gone back to the spot later and confirmed that her remains were still lying where he'd left them. Manya was terrified of him, and for years she said nothing to anyone, carrying the dark secret with her. What finally cracked the case open had nothing to do with Kimberly at all. In the early 2000s, Raidmaker was arrested over his disturbing activities with an underage girl, which, knowing his history, was on brand for this sicko. When that arrest happened, the girl told police something startling. He'd bragged to her about ending a model's life years earlier. For reasons that were never fully explained, the lead wasn't chased down right away. Only after Raidmaker was released did the account get the attention it deserved, and around the same time Manya finally came forward as well. Detectives went back to the old evidence and found something they could actually put in front of a jury. That was the fact that Raidmaker's phone number was sitting in Kimberly's records from the very day she vanished, a fact that I find highly unsettling. Another girlfriend, Cynthia, recalled that Raidmaker had driven her out to Kimberly's car on the night of February 28th and set it ablaze. When investigators recorded her phone calls with him, he admitted to torching the vehicle, though he flatly denied taking Kimberly's life. In March 2004, 12 years after a young mother left home for a modeling job that was never even real, David Raidmaker was finally arrested and charged. The trial began in January 2006, and the jury heard about the confessions he'd handed to the women in his life. They heard about the phone records that tied him to Kimberly's final day, and his own admission about the burned car. They didn't believe his denials, and in February 2006, they found him guilty, with the special circumstance that he'd abducted her. That verdict made him eligible for the ultimate penalty, but on March 30th, 2006, a judge handed him life in prison without the possibility of parole. 14 years after Kimberly Pandelios answered an ad for a photo shoot that didn't exist, the man who'd written it finally had a cell with his name on it. The thing that really disturbs me about this case is how long Raidmaker was able to get away with it. While I can understand why Manya didn't go to the cops out of extreme fear, the rest of it remains a mystery to me. Detectives had his number within a week of the slaying, and just apparently never fully investigated all the numbers in her appointment book. If this was a much more minor offense, I could see why the resources may not have been dedicated, but given the crime, this makes no sense. To make matters even worse for detectives, this wasn't some number that was buried deep in the book. It was right on the latest date. The thing that really truly makes no sense to me is the fact that he wasn't investigated further after the girl he assaulted told them what Raidmaker had done. Now hear me out for a second on this one, because I have a theory, and as usual, when it's speculative, I'll admit that right off the bat. Raidmaker was operating some sort of underground escort network in Los Angeles, perhaps the sort of operation that rich and powerful people may have used. I have to question whether he may have had some compromising material on people in positions of power and authority that kept him protected. That said, maybe I'm overthinking it, and maybe it was all just pure incompetence all along. I feel like I'm asking for a lot of feedback from my audience for this video, but I'd like your thoughts on this theory as well.